Morning, everybody. So my name is Christoph Luykx. I'm the Policy Director at Orgalim, Europe's Technology Industries, and welcome at this event on industrial AI and what future regulatory footprint. So what I would like to highlight is that this event is important or eventful for two reasons. First of all is we are December 2nd, and this is exactly 1 year day-to-day ago that we had our first event on AI, which at that time was also with the head of unit for the same unit in DG Connect with Max Lemke. Of course, that has changed now. So we have now passed the year. It's been a very eventful year, of course. And so we thought it was a good time now, a year later, to take stock and have a discussion on what is happening next year. The second reason why this is eventful is because this event fits into our industrial strategy in focus series. So we've had a lot of events throughout the year that are focusing on different aspects of industrial strategy. And we thought it would be a good topic for this last event to really focus on industrial AI because it's so important to our industries. So it is important to know what our industries are, right? For the people who don't know Orgalim yet. So here's a quick introduction, a couple of key figures when it comes to Orgalim. First of all, who are the sectors that we are representing? And this is important to know because this will also, of course, determine a little bit the angle that we're taking for this event. So we represent three big sectors: mechanical engineering, metal technology, electrical engineering, electronics, and ICT. And to give you kind of a flavor of how big these three sectors together are the figures that you see on top. So it's almost 1/3 of the EU's annual exports, 11.5 million direct employment, and our industry is comprised of 770,000 companies, big and especially small. And so this is important to kind of note on how we're approaching the AI topic. What will we discuss today? What is it really that we want to focus on? We've brought together a great, I think, list of panelists. You will see them on the slide, the speakers that we have for today. These speakers will be talking about, of course, the upcoming AI legislation. I'm sure most of you are here to hear from the European Commission again on where their thinking is with regards to AI legislation. Of course, we will focus heavily on that. But of course, it's not in isolation. There are already existing pieces of legislation out there where the same questions are being asked about the impact of AI. For example, there is the Machinery Directive when we talk about safety. And there is, of course, a whole range of liability regime legislation that is also in place already. And even here, you hear these questions: how is AI impacting these pieces of legislation? And we will also see updates, revisions next year to these. So we don't only want to focus on an AI-specific legislation, but also how does that relate to the existing framework, and how is the existing framework potentially be updated next year? So we are going to take a broader picture. Now, how are we going to do that? So this is the program. We will start with some opening remarks from two speakers. So first of all, we will have Rada Rodriguez, our president, opening. Then we will, of course, turn to Kilian Gross from DG Connect. And then we will turn to a panel discussion. And even though it is difficult sometimes, but we want to make it as interactive as possible, we will try to do that via two ways. We will have a couple of polls running throughout the event, where we will ask your feedback. And so I think we have a couple of interesting ones lined up. And then there's, of course, also the chat function, as was mentioned. You can ask me or you can ask us any questions you want. You can also make some comments, but please keep them as short as possible. And I will try to keep track of all of that throughout the discussion. So that is it from my side on the opening remarks. Before I hand over to Rada Rodriguez, I just wanted to actually launch the first poll because it kind of frames a bit the discussion. And the first poll is, do we need AI legislation? You see the various options there. I believe that you can start voting now. And as these votes are coming in, and we will we'll keep track of that, of course, let me introduce, first of all, also Rada Rodriguez. So Rada Rodriguez is president of Orgalim, and she will deliver a couple of opening remarks before we hand over then to Kilian Gross. I don't know if we have seen some of the numbers already coming in on the polls.
Yes, we have almost half of the attendees that have already voted.
Okay, so, and we're around 117 people that are attending, which in itself is already, of course, great. So let's maybe close the poll.
Okay.
And let's see if we can see the figures. So basically, a majority, 49%, says yes, legislation, we need it, but it needs to be targeted, followed by yes, we are already late. And then 21% says no, and 7% says definitely no. We will come back to this poll, by the way, at the end of the event. So let's see if there's a difference in the numbers. But it's good to kind of frame the discussion. And I'm sure Mr. Gross will come back to that also in a moment. But first of all, let me hand over to Rada Rodriguez. Rada, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Christoph, for this introduction. A warm welcome also from my side to all the attendees, and a special thanks to all the panelists, all the guests, the member of the Commission who are joining us today in this event. As Christoph was mentioning in the beginning, this event is another step in our effort to bring together policymakers and industrial players to discuss how in Europe we can develop further artificial intelligence, the use of artificial intelligence for good and for all. As we are representing the technology industries, the European technology industries, our technologies are very often horizontal, which means that they are enabling the development of all the other industrial and economical sectors, or many of them at least. And it is also so that our technology industries are characteristic by the development and deployment of advanced manufacturing technologies, which was the strength of this industry in the past, and it is still today, and we want, of course, to keep it also for the future. That's why in the manufacturing sector, we are already using artificial intelligence technologies. Maybe not all of them, not at the same level, but for sure the machine learning and also some pilots with deep learning and other technologies are ongoing. So whatever will be the new legislation in artificial intelligence, it will have a big impact on manufacturing and on the technology industry in Europe. Here we are building on our broad expertise, which we have, the domain know-how which we have in the different sectors of our industries, and we are combining this with artificial intelligence technologies in order to keep this competitive advantage which we have today in the global race for competitiveness. The Commission published in February last year a white paper where it was already outlined the future regulatory framework for the next generation technologies. And we see also since then in the different discussions we have with policymakers that there are, and also with the civil society, that there are still a lot of questions regarding the risk of harm associated with the use of AI, and also a lot of questions linked to how to use in a let's say in a responsible manner the data which the models of artificial intelligence are based on. It is clear that we will have this piece of legislation next year, as it was announced. However, there are still certain questions, and Christoph was highlighting it very well in the beginning, which we want to discuss with you today, and we want to continue the dialogue on these topics. So, first of all, very important to frame the scope of this legislation. Secondly, also to see how this legislation will be in relation with already existing pieces of legislation, and I'm thinking specifically on Machine Directive, but also on Product Liability Directive, and it might be others as well. And finally, as I said in the beginning, this legislation will have a very big impact on our industries, on our ability to develop further our competitiveness and remain global competitive. So to conclude, I would like to put forward 2 points that I think will be good for discussion today and also later when we continue this dialogue. First, how should industrial artificial intelligence be defined? Because very often we see it on a high level of conceptualization, specifically when it comes with the general public, as a broad umbrella notion. This is giving the impression that we can tackle artificial intelligence at one piece and also eventually regulate it as such. We are definitively of the opinion that this is not the case. There are already tens of thousands of different use cases, and we have to distinguish very clear between low-risk artificial intelligence operated, for instance, in closed environments, and then, on the other hand, the high-risk artificial intelligence, which for sure might have a proved impact on customers. Secondly, how do we want to move forward? We are of the opinion that it is too early to go into a legislative mode, at least when it comes to the industrial artificial intelligence, which we strongly believe that it should not be in the scope of the new legislation. We believe that the existing regulation is already fit for purpose and that it is already addressing the different challenges linked to that. That's why we believe that the best way is to proceed with a soft law approach, with a type of guidelines, and a very robust standardization on this topic. This will give us the opportunity to learn from this technology, and then by learning to identify potential challenges. We should never forget that this is a very fast evolving technology and that we are just at the beginning. I am looking forward to the discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you, Rada. And you asked already a couple of, let's say, very clear questions. You made a couple of clear points. So I am sure that Mr. Gross will also talk about some of those. So going now to the second opening remarks to Kilian Gross. Of course, Kilian is, most of you know him, head of unit and technologies and systems for digitizing industry in DG Connect. And he is going to give a bit of an overview of some of the plans from the European Commission. Kilian, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Christoph, and thanks a lot, Ms. Rodriguez, for this kind introduction and your kind words and the invitation. And thanks and good morning to the audience, and thanks for your interest for this topic, which indeed I think is very important, and it's very timely to discuss this today. So I'm very grateful to be here and to have the chance to exchange a bit with you. I will try the impossible, namely to summarize a bit in between 5 and 10 minutes where we stand and what is our thinking, to frame a bit the discussion which we want to have then later on the panel and with the audience. Our starting point in the Commission is unchanged. We believe that AI has a lot of potential, is good for consumers, for business, for the public interest. And we could just see this in the COVID crisis, how AI can help to develop vaccines, sanitizing robots, or to help diagnosing COVID-19. So it's not only a competitiveness issue, it's not a societal issue. And I just read this morning that there's a breakthrough that AI is better than human beings in identifying proteins. So there is a lot of things we can do with AI for our economy, but as well for our society. So there's a lot of advantages. On the other hand, and that I think is shown already by the poll which you just have launched, there are some concerns, and these concerns are mainly linked to fundamental rights and to safety issues. And these concerns may hinder the uptake of AI And therefore, we believe in the European Commission that there is no contradiction between supporting AI and its uptake and development and proposing a regulatory framework for trustworthy AI, because both go together. We will only have a successful uptake and a wide uptake of AI in Europe if our citizens and the consumers believe in this AI and believe that this AI is trustworthy. That's why we had from the beginning in the Commission, we had this approach based on 2 pillars, and this is as well the underlying idea of our white paper, which we published in February, on the 19th of February, where we suggest an ecosystem of excellence on the one hand side and an ecosystem of trust on the other side. And the ecosystem of excellence is basically all the measures we want to undertake, and we are very committed to support the uptake of AI. And the ecosystem of trust is, and we will discuss this in more detail later, the regulatory framework. But I don't want just to jump on the ecosystem of trust, because I think it is important to recall that the Commission is really committed to AI. We don't have anything against AI. We don't put this technology under general suspicion. On the contrary, but we believe as any technology, it may bring some risks, and therefore it's better to address these risks appropriately from the beginning in order to avoid harm and afterward perhaps a rejection of this technology. So what we have outlined before in our strategic action plan is the idea that we would like to see in Europe 20 billion of private and public investments in AI per year in the next decade to come, in order to catch up with the US and China. And for this, we have suggested in this ecosystem of excellence a number of activities. So we will revise the coordinated plan, which is mainly asking member states at the core to develop national AI strategies and trying to put them together to a European strategy and to coordinate them in order to create synergies. And we are already quite advanced. Most member states now have a strategy on AI, which as well shows the importance as well on the level of the member states to support this technology. We want to see excellence centers, excellence testing centers in Europe where AI can be tested under real life conditions. We want to create a network of leading universities. We will roll out the European digital innovation hubs, and we would like to see in each member state at least one hub specialized on AI. And we will work with the InvestEU fund, but as well now with the RRF, so the Recovery and Resilience Facility, in order to have more investments, not only in the digital industry, but as well in the rest of the economy, in order to uptake, in particular, digitization and AI. We will suggest a new partnership on AI, a public-private partnership, which should as well help the development of groundbreaking innovation. And we will launch an Adopt AI program to reinforce the uptake of AI in public procurement. So these are just a number of measures which should show that the Commission is really dedicated to support the uptake of AI, because we think in the first hand, this is a great opportunity. At the same time, we understand, and that is the outcome of your poll today, that there are some risks, and that is what we put in the white paper under ecosystem of trust. So we would like, that we suggested, let's look at a risk-based approach. We had the high-level expert group working for 2 years. They suggested to us a framework, a tool, how to assess AI, the so-called Altai tool, a self-assessment tool, how to assess the trustworthiness of AI, and we based ourselves on this. And we looked how could these elements from the high-level expert group be transformed into mandatory requirements for an ex-ante conformity assessment for high-risk AI systems. Should this be complemented with a voluntary labeling scheme? And could there be as well a place for soft law? And what should we look at in these requirements? We then, on the basis of this white paper, we launched a public consultation. And this public consultation, starting in February and running until mid-June, had an overwhelming response. We got more than 1,215 respondents to our consultation, a very mixed and balanced group between citizens, business, civil society, academia, public authorities, and others, spread all over Europe, and even third countries like China and the US and the UK were very active. In addition, we received more than 400 position papers, PDF documents, sometimes very detailed and very full of content. So there was a really overwhelming interest in this consultation. And this is quite interesting then to see what is the result, because we could see in the result, and I just summarized a few aspects. You can find the full report of the results now on the homepage of the Alliance for Artificial Intelligence from the European Commission. Only 3% in that consultation, that is just, I come to this because we just had this little poll, believe that the current legislation is sufficient. 33% believe of our respondents that the current legislation has gaps, and 42% say outrightly we need new legislation. So I think there is a very clear majority saying the current legislation is not fully fit for purpose. On the other side, when we asked, shall we focus this new legislation on high risk, 43% said that this is the correct approach. We should limit it to high risk AI applications, but 31% did not agree. So they probably would like to have even more regulation. And then we looked a little bit, what are really the concerns which people would like to be addressed in this new upcoming legislation? Then there is clearly the overwhelming majority, 90% say the most important is to avoid breaches of fundamental rights and in particular discrimination. Another very important point is safety, but to a little bit to a lesser extent than these fundamental rights and the discrimination. On this basis now we have worked intensively and we are preparing this legislation, which of course needs first to be adopted by our political masters, by the college. But we are in the making, so to say. So we prepared an impact assessment. We are working intensively with stakeholders, but as well inside the house now to draft on the basis of the public consultation, on the basis of our impact assessment and on the white paper, what could be the future AI regulation. And we clearly see a need for a horizontal act. We think it makes sense to have a horizontal legislation because AI has certain risk features which are inherent in artificial intelligence, notwithstanding the sector or the use. So it makes sense to define common criteria. We believe that this legislation should really be risk-based. So it should look at high-risk systems and identify what are high-risk systems, because we are convinced that the overwhelming majority of AI applications is not risky, or at least not highly risky, and should not be made subject to ex-ante conformity assessments. So we will suggest a methodology how to identify high risk. We will suggest mandatory requirements for ex-ante conformity assessment for these high-risk cases. This should be followed up by, as usual, by an ex-post market monitoring, because we have as well to look a little bit at the use case. We are still considering look at the voluntary scheme to complement this. We're looking as well whether we need some minimum obligations for non-high risk things. But to come back to the question of President Rodriguez, we think that a lot of AI use, for instance, in production, like predictive maintenance or optimization of production processes, which is not human related, which has not a human interface, is probably not risky at all and doesn't need any additional requirements. When we think what should be checked for those high-risk systems, we still believe that the requirements from the white paper are very useful and should then be further extended. Namely, training should be looked at, data record keeping, the information which should be provided, the robustness and accuracy of the system, and the human oversight. And that should be part of this ex-ante conformity assessment. Here, I think, and there I come back to what President Rodriguez said, standards will play a crucial role. We need to see how we organize this ex-ante conformity assessment in order not to duplicate processes. This is very important to us. We are aware that we are active in an area which is already normally regulated because we are active in areas which are of high risk. Therefore, this must seamlessly integrate this new process in existing processes. It's very important for us, and we will make sure that this works out well. And we will try to make it very practical by having operational standards which should help to implement this. Our idea is that we will come out with this proposal in spring next year, somewhere at the end of the first quarter, and then we should start the legislative process. And you know, of course, as well, that the European Parliament already is very active. On their side, there is a report from the Member of Parliament Del Blanco on the ethical aspects of AI, which as well takes up, I think, a number of aspects which I just mentioned. And we have the member states, the letter of the 14th, so there is a lot of reaction and interest as well on the side of the co-legislators, and therefore we are looking very much forward to this process, which will certainly be very intense, but as well very interesting. But I think the topic deserves this attention. So I hope this was not too long and gives a little bit the scene for the further discussion. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Kilian. So I think you, of course, mentioned a couple of key points that I'm sure we'll come back to in the discussion. What I, however, would like to do, first of all, is to frame also the discussion is, we've been talking about industrial AI, Rada also mentioned it, but for some people it's still a bit an enigma, like what is industrial AI, right? And how does it compare to, for example, what we see in the business to consumer space? So what I would like to do is first maybe ask our panelists to talk a bit about a case study of industrial AI. I will start with Eva Virtute from the Kion Group, but before I do that and before I hand over to her, we are going to try to show you a video of the case study that she has. I have to warn you that the sound might be a bit kind of high, so you have to probably control it on your end. But let's have a look at that, and then I'll hand over to Eva. So yeah, let's play the video. So that was kind of the short video. I am going to hand over to Eva now. Eva, maybe you want to say, first of all, a couple of words about Kion and then about the example that we just saw.
Yes, so thanks, Christoph, and good morning, everybody, and thanks again for the introduction and for the invitation. Yes, the example we saw in the video is an example of an autonomous order picker from Steel, and Steel is a brand of the Kion Group again, and the Kion Group is a multinational corporation based in Germany with more than 35,000 employees worldwide, and we are one of the leading providers for industrial trucks or warehouse equipment, warehouse automation, and supply chain solutions. So for us, innovation is one of the main ambitions and goal in our development, and for sure digitalization is one of the main boosters. So for this reason, it is also the core of our strategy 2027. So coming back to the example, and I think that from me, who I come from the materials handling sector, one of the most interesting example is the automated guided vehicle. We have already a lot of solutions already available in the field, and what I showed before is an example on how a machinery equipped with the AI solution can really help and provide support to the operator. So in this case, how does it work? So our Igoneo intuitively adjusts the route and the speed thanks to AI. But how does it work? So the vehicle makes decisions based on data transmitted and defined algorithm. So in that way, obstacles are either avoided or the truck stops when the path is completely blocked. So if a slower vehicle drives ahead or if a traffic jam develops, the speed is adapted to the situation. And once the route is clear again, then the OPX Igoneo moves up autonomously. These functions because the operator is tracked using 6 different sensors and combine them in a tracking module that needs to take into account the noise from each sensor and also needs to find the true positives where the operator is at the current time. These information are very important for us and is handed to a tracker to at the time as another dimension to the algorithm. So on each step of new sensor readings, we know the current position of the operator with a given variance, the past positions, and we can get the motion vectors from these to see where the operator is heading to. So the advantage of this already available technology is quite evident, both in terms of health for the operators and also in terms of efficiency of the timeline. For instance, we saw in the video that there is a high reduction in terms of mounting and dismounting activities for the operator, with a lot of benefits in terms of ergonomics, for instance. And of course, the time that is saved by doing this operation, thanks to this autonomous order picker, can be used by the operator for doing other tasks. So that, I think, is a very good example on this new technology, well, not really new, but young technology already available on the market.
Great, thank you, Eva. I think this was a really good example of what industrial AI can do, right? A couple of things stand out already. First of all, it's a closed environment that you're operating this. And the other part is, of course, as you mentioned, safety. And this is where the Machinery Directive also comes in, but we'll come back to that in a moment. So thank you, Eva, for that example. I have a second example, and actually, Mr. Gross already kind of gave it away. He mentioned predictive maintenance. And I have Christopher Gans, who is a real expert on industrial AI. And in his career, he has worked for a very long time for the ABB group in multiple parts, looking at AI from kind of R&D to kind of more the deployment side. So I'm really happy to have him here. So Christopher, thank you also. You had an example, and I believe it was also on predictive maintenance, right?
Yes, and here we touch already a little bit on what exactly is artificial intelligence. And today we mostly talk about these deep learning neural networks. And these networks are particularly good at mapping a situation set of variables to an outcome. And that is exactly what we're interested in condition monitoring, predictive maintenance. So we measure some values from a machine, values that we typically use to control it, to make sure it operates, but these measures, they contain some artifacts of upcoming failures, and these are very hard to explain with physical analysis, with physical models, but they represent themselves in the data. So what we can actually not, or very difficult, detect with the algorithms where we built the equipment with the simulators and the physics, we see in the data, and there we have seen quite a few good examples of where these measurements are mapped to a particular type of failure. And then if we have these measurements early before the upcoming failure, we can also say, well, this looks like something is going to happen in a week or 2 weeks, and then the plant can be taken offline at a time where it suits best, when it's not operating full capacity, compared to the failure occurring and the plant goes down and immediately has to stop. Artificial intelligence also adds another set of tools to these applications. Some experienced maintenance managers, they can walk into the plant and they hear already from the sound of the factories, something's not really going well. So from the traditional set of measurements from sensors, vibration, temperatures, all that, we can now add cameras that are looking at the plant, maybe thermal cameras. We can add sound recognition and add more sensors to these sensors that detect failures, and so come closer to human capabilities in diagnosing equipment, and even surpassing it by adding sensors a human doesn't have. For example, thermal imaging and other image giving technologies. And by that, avoiding the downtimes when it really is least beneficial to the operation of the plant.
Thank you, Christopher. I think that was as a good second example of when we talk about industrial AI, what are some of its applications? Now, as an industry, of course, we're not just looking at the technology, right? There is also the human factor that comes in when you talk about operators, but other people, and of course, the safety element comes in there. But the skills part, right, is also important. And so I would like to ask Jussi Mäkinen, who is from Technology Industries of Finland, who is one of our members, to say a couple of words what TIF, Technology Industries of Finland, is doing in that respect and working with their members, the corporations. So Jussi.
Thank you very much, Christoph, and good morning to everybody. Pleasure to be here. Yes, to put it short, we need AI in order to be ready to use AI to its fullest extent. So we're a trade organization representing more than 1,600 technology companies active in Finland. And we have placed pretty much weight on really bringing about the green and digital transformation. And it's not, when we are looking at the industry, it's not only the technological processes where AI comes into play and data comes into play. We also need to look at the skills. So data economy poses a very great challenge to companies' skills management. And we're about to initiate a project where we use AI and develop a concept by which our member companies can benchmark their skills base and evaluate how they need to develop it in order to adjust to this great transition. And we're frankly very excited about this project since it brings us to the very close to using actually AI.
Thank you, Jussi. So this sketched the picture about some examples, also the fact that it's not just about technology, it's about skills. Let me turn now a bit about some of the other topics we already touched upon, the existing legislation that is out there, and then I'll go back to what the Commission has proposed. Just a reminder also, you can ask, of course, questions. I see there was also already one question that came in. I will come back to that in a moment, but please submit any questions or comments, and I'll have a look at that. So let me go to the safety point, right? Because we mentioned that a couple of times. So maybe Eva, if I can turn to you again. One big part that is really important in the industrial sector is, of course, the Machinery Directive, which is from, if I'm not mistaken, around 2006, came into force around 2009. So we have already a long experience with that. But can you say a couple of words about the Machinery Directive and the safety part of that?
Yes, thanks, Christoph, for the question. Indeed, the Machinery Directive is now one of the pillars of the legislation for us manufacturers, at least in the materials handling sector. And indeed, one of the main goals of the Machinery Directive is to place on the market safety machinery. And we, based on our experience, the Machinery Directive poses no legal gaps in terms of safety, even if we speak about AI or new technologies. That's thanks to its structure, because we know that the Machinery Directive is technology neutral. And so thanks to that, it is able to cover a lot of the risk posed by new technologies. For instance, if we look at the Annex 1 of the Machinery Directive, we can see that all the health and safety requirements relating to the design and the construction of machinery are already covered in the text. And moreover, thanks to the NLF approach and the support of harmonized standards, we as manufacturers are able really really to design and develop safety machinery. I think that this combination of neutral structure of the Machinery Directive together with the technical standards that really set the state of the art really provides a good legal framework for us to develop safety machine. Just to give you maybe another insight, when we have to place on the market machinery, we have already to carry out a risk assessment and then a conformity assessment procedure in order to place safe machine on the European market. And this is completely covered by the Machinery Directive. And the proof of this good function of the legislation we have is that we already have on the market AI technologies available and the safety machine on the market.
Yeah, and so this is so. Sorry for the people in the audience that are not so familiar with Machinery Directive, but we want to talk about that, right? Because it is core to the discussion. There is now a revision also happening, right, or going to come. The
Yes.
Machinery Directive, or MD, will be revised next year. What was the timeline again for that, Eva?
It's the first quarter of 2021. We have a bit of delay due to this COVID-19 situation, which postpone a lot of regulation from the original deadline. Yeah.
And so one of the discussions that we're having now also, and this is by the way led by DG Grow, is discussion on what is the impact of new technologies like AI on legislation like the Machinery Directive. So
yes,
we are having that discussion, and let's see where the Commission will go with their proposal. But maybe then bringing it back to Mr. Goss and the current plans, right, for end of Q1. You mentioned, Kilian, that the scope, let's focus on the scope first of all, that it will be horizontal. So if I understand correctly, that means that when we look at the B2C space, which of course has its own challenges, versus business to business, the B2B space, they will all be within scope with a qualifier about, for example, risk, right? But are you looking at both sectors in this piece of legislation?
Well, we look first, as I said, we will do a horizontal legislation on AI. So we will come up with a definition on AI, and we will try within this definition to identify what is high risk. And high risk will be linked to certain legal goods like life, liberty, property, democracy, and of course to the size of the risk or the probability of harm occurring. So I think it would be difficult to exclude now to say one sector with B2B will completely be excluded, for instance, or it will only be B2C. I think that will not be really the approach. I think the idea will be to have an ex-ante conformity assessment which makes sure that a product which is either brought on the market, which exceeds the market at the moment that it comes to the market, or it's put into use because it can as well be developed in-house in a bigger group, for instance, that's the same. Once it's comes to the first deployment, is complying with these standards. So there may be B2B operations before because you might sell the machine from one company to another. But if there is, in the end, of course, it comes to the if it comes to the market, the first time it goes to the market, it would have to fulfill these requirements. I think in your context, a lot which is done just in, let's say, production or maintenance will have an impact on the risk qualification, because we will have to see, is there a risk to violate fundamental rights? And if I have an AI, like in your example, on this little van driving around and helping picking up goods, that is probably less likely. There, I guess there could be an issue of safety because it's a human-machine interaction, because that's the other aspect we look at. But I could, from the first sight, I would not really see an implication for human rights. That would be difficult to imagine. So there, I guess we will see this risk on violations of human rights mainly in all applications or uses where you have interaction with humans directly. Whereas in the whole production side, you will hardly have this. There you may have, if there's human-machine interaction, you may have a safety aspect which may be controlled. But just because you mentioned the Machinery Directive, our idea is indeed that whatever we will propose, because not for me to decide this, of course, today, it will be part of the assessment as it is done already. So you just mentioned, if you come with a new machine now and you go to the market, you do a risk assessment. So you would check, I need to comply with the Machinery Directive. Perhaps the machine has a Bluetooth function, then you have even to comply with the Radio Equipment Directive. And in the future, you would have as well then to check within this assessment of risks, oh, my device will include AI. So, and if the device fulfills the criteria for high risk, then I would have as well to respect the AI requirements. It would just be completing the picture and precising a bit more this element of the machine, but it would still be the same conformity assessment. You would go to one ex-ante conformity assessment for this machine, and this ex-ante conformity assessment would then include a part on this AI on top of the part compliance with the Machinery Directive or compliance with other regulatory acts which may be needed or triggered by the device. But again, we will not distinguish between B2B and B2C, but in the risk analysis, of course, it will play a major role whether a device or an application has a direct interaction with humans or is basically in machine-machine communication. There certainly the risk level will be in general lower.
Yeah, and I think we get already immediately to the heart of the debate, right? And what we actually really wanted to discuss, which is the AI legislation, of course, the upcoming AI legislation is not going to stand in isolation, right? There is existing legislation. You mentioned, for example, also the Radio Equipment Directive, exactly. And so the question will become, how do we avoid fragmentation, right? So how do we, and you mentioned this also in your opening remarks, Kylian, in regards to the role of standards in that. But if I just focus for a moment on the high risk point, is there anybody from the panelists also who wants to jump in on how they would look at that, and maybe also how that is done currently in the MD, or how you see that interact with Machinery Directive? Is there anybody who wants to, Jussi? By the way, I should have said Jussi is not only working for TIFF, he also is the chair of our AI task force here in Orgalim. So Jussi, a couple of comments from your side.
Thank you. I'm a lawyer by training, and it's very easy to sympathize the approach of having kind of a two-tier approach. It's somehow evident that we need to concentrate on high-risk cases. But then there are two issues that keep coming to my mind. One is the flexibility in scope, and how does that affect the legal certainty and predictability of this forthcoming regulation. And then there is this tricky question that what happens if some kind of incident comes from that basket that has been regarded as being low risk? Then it would place an enormous strain on this legal framework to quickly adjust it. And this in turn might prove rather problematic for the industry. So my worst fear is that everyone has to comply with the requirements on the high risk side in order to be to have AI systems that are applicable widely on the industry.
Eva, you also wanted to jump in?
Yes, thanks, Christoph. Just a couple of remarks on the comment on high risk or low risk AI, because I think this is a very important and sensitive topic to discuss. And to be honest, I think it's also difficult to reply, because I think the real question is if industrial AI is high risk or a low risk one, and I think that it really depends on the situation and on the individual application of AI and on the environment. So just to give a quick example to explain a bit more. Well, if we have a robot, for example, that detects people in its surrounding and using AI, and maybe from this information the robots can avoid collisions with the human being. And of course, if it fails, we may have an injury, and so we can refer to that maybe as an high risk AI, because of course we have a very important damage and a real injury. But then if maybe in the same robot we have, for instance, a personal safety scanner or another systems that thanks to AI can intervene if the human detection fails, then of course the risk of AI is lower. So that to me means that we really need to look at the circumstances and the application. And this is the critical part, I think, to discuss what is high risk or low risk AI. And so when we consider that in terms of legislation, I think we really need to look at maybe cases or provide clear criteria of what is the high risk AI, what is not, and maybe providing use cases, but look at it very carefully, especially now, because we are developing so fast this kind of technology.
Yeah, last maybe comment, and then maybe Killian, if you want to respond to that. You wanted to say something?
I wanted to comment maybe on this one.
Yeah, sure. Rada, go ahead.
Just shortly. It's like Eva was very well pointing out, and I was also trying to explain that in my openings, that already today we have tens of thousands of use cases and applications. So not all in industry, of course, there are a lot in the B2C, so I'm not touching those. But because of this extreme complexity, we will not be able to, in a regulation, to be sure that we have taking all these use cases. On the other hand, these are based on the knowledge we have today, and the knowledge of today is changing extremely fast. So tomorrow we will have a completely different knowledge base with probably even more use cases, so even more difficult to regulate. That's why I think that when it comes to only industrial artificial intelligence, only on the industrial applications, which let's say that we could somehow say today that they are low risk, that this soft type of approach, soft type of regulation with guidelines, with voluntary labeling, with risk assessment, etc., is maybe the best way to be sure that we really take in consideration present and future use cases.
Thank you, Rada. Killian, did you want to say something in response?
Yes, with pleasure. All the points you made are very relevant and very pertinent. So this is, and I'm happy that you justify the complexity, because we're trying, of course, to get the regulation right, and it's a complex task, and it's not, it's far from easy, and we are as well learning. So that is. It's not so simple that you can say it's black or white. What I think, there are a couple of aspects which were mentioned in this discussion, which I think are very important. One is perhaps to say that we need to have what we call internally now a future-proof regulation. That is in particular for AI very, very difficult and important, because we will regulate now, we will do a proposal. This will be negotiated for 1 year, 1.5 years, and then we will have a time until it will come into force, and by then already the world will have significantly changed, and that will go on like this. And this is, of course, a destiny which we share with all regulators of very innovative technologies. I don't think this should lead to the idea that we give up regulation because we cannot follow. I think we need there to be more innovative ourselves as legislators to follow this. And one idea which we have is, for instance, that we create a legal framework which then can, for instance, via delegated act or other instruments, be adapted rather soon to new situations, so that we try to regulate what we know now and where we have evidence that there is harm, and that we then we set up a process in this regulation, how this can then be adapted rather quickly to new challenges, which may come later. Because otherwise we risk that we overshoot a little bit, because we will, now there is a lot of thoughts are there, a lot of ideas and visions, but it's not so clear which vision will really be realized and where will really be harm. There's a lot of hypothetical thinking and argument and discussion, but we should link, I think as legislators, we should link ourselves to elements where we can rather straightforwardly identify, yes, there is harm, and harm has occurred, and there is a problem, and we should solve this problem. We should not solve problems which we anticipate or which we imagine could arise, but we should provide the means that if there is a problem as well in an area which we are perhaps not put on this list of high risk in the beginning, we can rather quickly adapt in order to keep this instrument a bit breathing and up to pace with the development. I think that is crucial. Second, in order to be innovation friendly, I think it will be very important that we try, even if this is complex, to be as clear as possible. Because of course it would be easy for us as legislators to say, well, we give you some criteria how to assess risk, and then each AI developer has to assess by him or herself if it's risky or not, because we will put all the burden basically on the developer. And the result would be a huge uncertainty. And in case of doubt, you would always think, okay, then I better comply with the requirement, because otherwise I run the risk, because who knows how my application will be used later on, and who knows in advance whether this application at one point may lead to a problem. And if I then have not done the checks, I might be liable or I might face legal consequences. So I think what is really important for us is that we try with the best of our means, this will probably not be perfect, but as good as we can, to identify where we think there are use cases which already today we think, yes, there is a risk, because there is, for instance, a human-machine interaction, and this AI is relevant for this machine-human interaction, like an autonomous car. And if this goes wrong, there can be a serious damage. And I think if we do this, it as well makes sense, because humans and the public at large will only accept the use of AI, take the car, if they feel this complies to highest and uniform safety standards. They can rely on this, otherwise they will not accept this if there is this exposure to a human being. And the same holds true, of course, for not so much industrial AI, for applications in the social sphere, like recruitment or others. Companies will not use these tools if they fear that afterwards they might be accused of discrimination, or they might have legal redresses. So I think there it comes together. So we need to look a bit at the use cases. And indeed, yeah, the use cases may differentiate, they may develop, and we need a bit of a dynamic system there to identify them on the basis of the evidence which is available. So that, I think, perhaps in a nutshell, would be my thoughts on the different arguments.
Good. I want to look at one of the questions that have been coming in. It's from Michael Nelson from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He's basically asking the question, we talk also a bit about ethics of AI and the need to regulate and the limit how it should be used. But he's asking the question the other way around. Is it ethical to delay the use of technologies that can save lives or dramatically improve society, just because lawyers cannot decide how to define or control software, or decide what is PII, what is industrial data? Now, maybe I don't want to focus so much on kind of the flipping the ethical question around, but on the point that he mentions also about the definitional side of it, right? It is difficult to define AI, and Keelan, you mentioned in the beginning, of course, if you do legislation on AI, you might have to come up with a definition of AI, right? It's not easy. So maybe who wants to step in on the point on kind of the definition discussions, the challenges maybe around that? And if somebody wants to focus also on the ethical part, of course, please do so. Anybody who wants to take this one? Christopher?
Yeah, I have a comment on the definition one, and I've been involved in a number of the definition exercises in Industrial Internet Consortium and others, and very often we ended up with a definition that by the letter is also valid for technologies that we have been using for decades. On the other hand, if I'm looking back at when it also, I mean, the last wave in the 80s when I was studying, what was considered AI at that time is today no longer considered AI, because now we master it and we fully understand it, and it's a tool like any other. So I would advise caution in tying a regulation too closely to a technology that we today label AI, because what will be very difficult if we have to look into is this now AI or not? Does this regulation hold or not? I much more favor this general risk-based approach. We have to understand the risk, and if we don't understand the risk of a particular technology, then we need to encapsulate it in something where we can actually judge the risk. We have to put the safety system around it. Similar, like we put a safety system around a human that is operating a plant. I mean, a human might behave pretty randomly, and still we can deal with this behavior because we say we pretty much assume that the human will behave in any way possible. So we put a safety system around that behavior to actually control that risk where we don't know the details of the risk. So I would rather propose this type of approach because, first of all, we don't really know what's coming. We might make today's neural networks explainable and trustworthy, but it might be replaced by something that somebody else is calling AI that has nothing to do with what we currently understand, or we might be facing a new technology that somebody is calling whatever, digital avatar or something new, and not relate to it as AI, but it has the same risk behind.
So are you basically saying that any legislation that's focused on a specific technology, right, which is at this point of legislation, and as Kilian also said, when we propose legislation today, it doesn't mean it will come into force tomorrow, right? Are you saying that any legislation that would do that or try to do that and pin a technology down is basically setting itself for failure, or am I misrepresenting what you just said, Christopher?
No, but particularly in AI with this very fuzzy definition, I think there are technologies that are much easier and much more narrowly defined. There it might work well, but I think AI has a few aspects. One of all, before all, some market participants are in a hype cycle and call pretty much anything AI to make marketing, regardless of what kind of a technology is used. So with AI, it is particularly difficult.
Okay, so the point being AI, how do you define that, right? We get back to that question. So Jussi, your thoughts on that?
Yes, thank you. I think that the problem or challenge we are having is when we look at the regulatory landscape, we have mostly technology neutral pieces of legislation, such as Eva and Rada mentioned the Machinery Directive, and then we have the Product Liability Directive, and then we have also a near-lying piece of legislation, which is the GDPR. And I think that what is in common with all these, that they regulate human behavior. So in other words, processes, how to use this and this technology, and how to reach this and this level of safety and security. And then on the GDPR side, we have the totally flexible process for first risk assessment and then risk mitigation. And then we are having rather great challenge, firstly, to define the scope of this technology-based piece of legislation. Not only it is hard, as Christopher explained, to define AI as such, but then we have the extra challenge of defining high-risk use of AI. So then we are diving quite deep into the qualms of technology, and having some experience myself also in preparation of legislation, that is a very great challenge indeed.
So I'm going to ask another question that came in, but before that, Kilian, do you want to say something about, do you have a definition at this point about AI, or are you not going to attempt even to go there? I just want to be clear on that.
Well, this is a distinguished panel with experts, so all what you say is, of course, correct. there are lots of definitions out there. We had developed one, let's say, by ourselves, by the high-level expert group. We have an OECD definition. Others as well work on this kind of definition. We will certainly have some kind of definition in this, probably something which is internationally recognized in this regulation. But we are aware that, of course, we have to avoid, let's say, a terminological debate. It's not really about how you call it. I think Christopher there is pretty right. In 5 years, it might be called differently. And now we call it machine learning or neural networks. And then there are other things, expert systems, symbolic reasoning, and there might be something completely new in parentheses, which will mix different elements from things in the past and bring up new technologies. So our key thing here is that we need, in the legislation, again, we need a rather open definition probably to cover different technologies which display this kind of risk which we want to cover. And then we will try to identify as well, perhaps in an annex or something like, concretely which kind of technologies we would like to look at now. And we know that we may need to adapt it over time, because we may learn that other techniques are used, and it should not be the case that something is excluded just because it's called differently. That's obvious. Because the reason why we want to do this legislation and why we think it makes sense to deviate perhaps from the classical approach to regulate by sector, say machinery, cars, medical devices, toys, as we do usually, is that we believe that this technology displays certain features, which is opacity, lack of predictability, lack of transparency, autonomy in behavior, data dependency, to name a few, which make it a bit more difficult to reconstruct input and output. So to say, I put in A and then B comes out, and that's how it works. And that's why a decision has been taken in that or that way. And if B is wrong, where was the mistake? In this AI, this is often described in literature then as this black box, which I don't like in particular because it puts the technology under a general suspicion and it looks a bit like magic or like suspicious, which is not true because it can deliver excellent results. But it's a bit, in our legal system, it's a bit more difficult if you have a system where you cannot really trace why a certain decision or decision-making tree, how it has worked out. We need additional tools in order to allow for the same protection as we had in the analog world. I mean, that's our starting point. We do not want to create new rights or new burdens or extend the protection. We just want to make sure, and I think that is what people expect, that when we move from the analog to the digital world, the level of protection and the way you can enforce your rights is not affected because there's a different technology used. That's all. So that's why we need a bit of documentation. So if you think, I should have been recruited, but the AI system has rejected me, and I believe this was on unfair grounds, you should have the same chances to get a justification than you would have if there was a human being filtering out the applications. I think that's a bit the idea. Therefore, I think we will need a definition because we need to define the scope. But we need some openness and again to be future-proof in order to allow to identify which technologies, how they're named. There's no limit to imagination, what could come in the next, but which technologies are displaying these features and therefore are justified, should be in a justified way, be subject to these rules. That's a bit would be our approach, I think, to this.
Good, and so just going back, because I'm looking at the questions and a couple of comments of those are related again to, okay, you have this legislation where you have the definition of AI or open definition, you have the discussion on what is high and low risk, but there is these other pieces of legislation, right? The Machinery Directive is, again, one thing that comes up. For example, Kai Peters from VDMA, which is also one of Orgalim's members, it's a German member, is mentioning, of course, again, that a lot of the existing AI applications, and when we talk about industrial AI, they are already covered, of course, by these existing pieces of regulations, such as the Machinery Directive. So, and he then also says, and Kai, correct me if I'm misreading it, but why not just presume that if they are covered by other pieces of legislation, they are actually low risk? And you can make that link then to the new legislation. So that's one thing that was mentioned. Then I think there's other comments also from Jürgen Heiles around, again, the fact that the Machinery Directive, and I hope I am phrasing the comment right, is looking at, of course, specific use cases and the level of risk in that. And the question that he asked is, so what would be the specific focus of an AI-specific high-risk regulation, given that we already have that within the MD? And Jürgen, if I'm not quoting it right, please comment. But just so we keep coming back again to this, there is this legislation, and then how will it relate to the others? Maybe then I'll use that as an opportunity to bridge to your earlier point, Kilian, about the role and also Rada of standards, right? But you also mentioned, Kilian, schemes. I don't know if I heard that right. So any thoughts from anybody on how would that work? What will be the role of standards and linking it to this AI legislation or other pieces of legislation? So I'm just a bit not clear yet on how that would work. So I don't know who wants to pitch in on standards, and maybe Kilian, if you could say something about this point on schemes. Anybody wants to go first? Jussi?
Thank you. I think we already have an ISO standard for processes for complying with the GDPR regulation and the processes it requires. But then the question about standards is, what do we want to standardize while using AI? Do we want to look at the human processes? Do we want to look at technological solutions? So it's a kind of a very wide array of questions, but then standardization, I think it works once you get the scope right and everyone is sharing the same problem and sharing the same language. Perhaps Eva can carry on from this.
Eva, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I was muted. Thanks. Yes, I just want to mention that based on my experience, technical standards are playing and will play a very important role in order to develop new technologies, help us manufacturers to create and develop safety machinery, and also to help Europe to compete internationally. As Jussi mentioned, there are already a lot of ISO standards, so international standards. For instance, we are already regarding AGVs, and I think it is a very crucial and important point for European industries to have the support of European institutions in promoting the development of standards regarding AI technologies, or also in future new kind of technologies, and that will really help us and also Europe to compete internationally.
Rada?
Yes, I have a short comment on standardization. I mean, exactly what Jussi was saying, and also Eve, is that if the frame is clear, then the process is finding its way of working. I think here it is important that we are not going in the temptation of creating some kind of parallel approach to standardization, as it is in case of the cybersecurity with the Cybersecurity Act, that we remain in the frame of new legislative framework, even if that has to evolve in order to be fit for the digital age, and to the fact that in when it comes to software, we have more and more of open standards and open source and architecture and use cases. So yeah, an evolution of the NLF for sure, but then not parallel approaches when it comes to standardization. That was my remark on that.
Yeah, Christopher, and then maybe back to Kilian, and then I'm going to run the next poll. So, Christopher.
Yes, I think with with standardization, we have a similar question than what we have here with the Machinery Directive and new legislation on AI. I mean, we're already operating on a broad range of standards depending on the application. So I think we should, as much as possible, try to map new technology on existing standards. So if the safety standard requires the proof of a certain level of reliability, then we should rather create a specific component that is explaining how you calculate reliability for this new technology, rather than adding a parallel standard for that particular technology to be safe. So safety is tied to reliability. Now let's look at how the new technology ties into reliability.
Good. Kilian, your response, and also on the schemes, maybe?
Yes, with pleasure. Perhaps I can come back as well to the question from BDMA on why do we need something if there is already the problem of safety is, for instance, already solved by the Machinery Directive, because I have the impression it's a feature which comes a bit back in the discussion, as that are we not over-regulating or duplicating regulation because this area is already regulated. Let me here perhaps make two remarks which I think are important. First is, we think that we can very much, and we will try to do this as far as possible, rely on the risk classification which exists in particular in the sectoral legislation, because the Machinery Directive has already a risk classification because it proceeds different kind of assessments for products, be it ex ante third-party conformity assessment or self-assessment or certification by a different department in the own company. So there are different levels of granularity for the conformity assessment, and therefore we have already risk assessments, and we will certainly look into that and follow these risk assessments. We don't want to reinvent the wheel, but we will follow what has been established and what has been proven to be effective and useful. Because we would as well like to follow the procedures, and we think whether those devices which have been considered to be high risk in the past, if then there is AI with an important function in these devices, then of course it should follow the risk assessment. The second is, yes, the Machinery Directive already prescribes rules on safety for these devices, and we will not set aside the Machinery Directive. This should fully work together with the Machinery Directive, and we work on a daily basis with the colleagues in GROW on this. It is just that the particular AI part, how to deal with the data, which data you need to, how do you do the testing of bias in the data set, which kind of data do you need to retain, this is not prescribed to this level of detail. And so this is an element in the part of the safety assessment where some certified bodies may already check this more or less because they have their own technical expertise, others may not, because they will basically look at the output of the whole machine if the safety standards of the machine as such are complied with. And we think there we can provide added value because we will make sure that as well this part on AI is in a uniform way when it's high risk, in a high risk device, and we follow these procedures. That is, then we have clear and uniform standards how to assess this part of the device. So it's nothing revolutionary, it will be part of it. It will fine tune and make more granular the assessment of the whole device and fill perhaps, as we see it, a gap in this assessment. In this respect, we think it is very important and useful that we try to develop standards, because we will in the regulation make a big effort to spell out even more the requirements as we have presented them in the white paper. We will try to make them more operational. But of course, the variety of use cases of AI will make it impossible to describe in all detail what you need to do, because the human oversight is different depending on the kind of AI you use, and you cannot prescribe in one rule what human oversight will always mean. You can only give a general, more or less general, or we will try to be as specific as possible, but to give in elements what you need to have. And then for the individual use case, you have to, I think, break it down in a standard so that then everybody knows what he or she has to do. Therefore, I think the standard development and to work together with standardization organizations is a very important element. This can be part of a bigger standard, it can be a standalone standard, that they are agnostic, but that we make sure that the requirements are translated into something which is really then for each individual use, whenever we have it high risk, because we still speak about a minority of cases, let's not forget. We think this is a small group of cases where we really identify a high risk and we justify this extra effort. There, we should then develop standards so that the developers and providers know what they need to do in order to fulfill the requirements and to manage this ex-ante conformity assessment.
Great, thank you. Let me run the next poll. We have like 10 minutes left. And the next poll is basically, we've talked about, right, the existence of existing legislation. Machinery Directive came up a lot. We, by the way, haven't talked really a lot about the liability part of it and how that would function. Maybe we can come back to that in a moment. But here's the question. So first of all, if you can go maybe to the next one, I want to run another poll. So just go to the next. There, this is the one. So we need to integrate specific AI provisions in other legislation. So you can start voting now, and we'll see what the outcome is in a moment. So Georgiana, if you can just call when you have a decent amount of responses coming in.
Okay, I think we should leave 30, 40 more seconds.
Okay, good. So as we are waiting for that, I mentioned liability, and I do want to talk about that. The other thing I still want to talk about is to up-level the discussion a bit again on the importance of industrial AI for, let's say, the twin objectives that were set out by the European Commission, right? Digitalization, of course, clearly there, but also the green part, sustainability. And so I want to make sure that we also touch upon that, but also on the point, and this is one of the questions coming in from Mariana Goldak-Altgassen with regards to the energy efficiency part. Like, what is actually the impact of AI on that part? I think it's just an interesting one I want to bring up because of the question. So, Georgiana, did we get the poll coming in?
Yes, I'm showing the results now.
Good. So basically, again, we need to integrate specific AI provisions in other legislation. The majority says, so almost 50% says no, we need to be technology neutral. The next part is yes, and then we have the differences. So it's interesting that the majority says no, but still there's a big part that says we actually should do that. So it's clear that this discussion will continue, and we will have definitely that discussion in 2021. So just to kind of start going towards the end of the discussion, I mentioned the liability discussion. Let's briefly talk about that. And I want to ask Jussi the question. Jussi, when you look at the B2B space, right, in the industrial context, and you talk about liability, how is that actually arranged now, currently, mostly?
There's we have this product liability directive, but then there's lots of weight on contracts. And I think that the contracts are actually very good weapon of choice here, since they provide the flexibility, and therefore we do not see any major or way reasons to change the state of affairs.
Anybody else who wants to say something about the liability discussion? So the contracts playing a crucial role in the B2B space. Eva?
Yes, I just want to support what Jussi just mentioned. I think it's very important to maintain a freedom of contract in the business-to-business relationship, and I think that contract can really address in a good way a lot of issues, including, of course, liability clauses. And then, as we mentioned before, we have a product liability directive, which, despite the age of the entry into force, is still fit for purpose in my view. So there is no need, based on my experience, to extend or review the scope of the product liability directive or to revise that. So I think we can count on a really good legal framework that's able to cover these challenges.
Good. I know we had to rush a bit, but this is another, we talked about Machinery Directive, but the whole liability framework is another part of an example of where that discussion is going to come up, right? How is AI potentially changing that or not? I do want to go back to the twin objectives, right? I think it's clear that AI, and Killian, you also mentioned at the beginning, the potential, of course, for AI to help Europe to lead. And if we look at industrial AI specifically, we are actually already very strong in that space, given our manufacturing base, the point that Rada mentioned earlier. But there is also the flip side, the sustainability part, right? How does AI help with the sustainability goals? But also, what are some of the challenges it might bring up? And this is the question I mentioned earlier. There's a question about what's the impact of AI itself on energy consumption, for example. I don't know, Christopher, if you want to say something about that?
Yes, there is some analysis, and this famous, often cited paper from the MIT that is actually stating that particularly the more complex AI systems, the very, very deep learning algorithms, they consume an awful lot of energy just for the training in the data centers. So if we are using AI to improve sustainability, we need to be really careful to not fall into the trap to actually spend more energy on training the networks than we save in the end.
Lucy?
Yes, thank you. We have some examples from our membership where where our member companies are reaching the stage where they have their industrial data on their processes, on their energy consumption and so forth available, and then they bring on AI analysis tools. And they have helped, use of these kinds of AI-driven analysis tools have helped our members to drive their efficiency up by 20%, and at the same time dropping their carbon emissions by that same amount. And I think that what Christopher mentioned about the complexity and the wealth of data, we are also, I think in Finland, we're also pioneers on this small data AI development. And I think that there are quite many industrial cases where we have rather limited and simple set of data that can be used to drive AI analysis tools. And by optimizing all these different processes in the industry, we can reach an immediate drop in our energy consumption and in the meanwhile carbon output, and without changing any major pieces of machinery.
Good. We are almost out of time. I am not going to give everybody again, let's say, the floor for closing remarks, but I do want to ask Killian, maybe if you want to, as the guest of honor, is there anything that you would like to add as a closing comment? I think you're on mute still, sorry.
I'm very pleased that I'm the guest of honor, and I feel very modest about it. It's very nice. No, but I think is I think most of the concerns and the points you brought up today are very much present in our reflection, because we need to get it right. It's the first kind of first kind of this legislation in the world. So we are front runners here. We're not basically preparing the 6th railway package or something. We're doing something completely new where we want to get it right. So we're really happy and grateful for advice and feedback from different stakeholders, and we like therefore to have this kind of open exchange as today or at other occasions. We will try to find a good balance between legal certainty and openness and future-proof, and at the same time keeping it staying proportionate. But we think, and that's my concluding word, we think in reality, if you look as well at the polls from you today, and there's our feedback from the public consultation, without a legal framework which addresses in a serious way certain risks which we cannot deny, we will not have a strong uptake in Europe of these technologies. We should not see this regulation as an obstacle, but we should see it as an enabler if we get it right and we get it in a proportionate and pragmatic way, so that it can help to ensure that all AI is trustworthy. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Killian. And just to go back, we had that first poll question. Remember this one? So I think it's a good time. So if you can just, as the last thing, attendees, respond again to this. I just want to see if there is a variation based on the discussion. I would be surprised, but still. So as we are running for that, I also would just like to highlight that at the end of this, you can fill out a survey. Please do so, because we always are looking at improving our events, of course. Share your impressions also via social media. So we'll show in a moment again the hashtags again. A news article and the recording of the webinar will also be posted on our website, www.orgalim.eu. And you can register also, of course, for our newsletters for more insights. So given that, did I give you enough time, Georgiana, to run the poll?
Yes, results are coming.
All right. So here are the results. Let me see that where we had the majority and now is, so yes, but it needs to be very targeted. That has slightly increased. Yes, we are already late. Actually, this decreased. Voluntary models also increased from 21 to 30%. And the last one, the 2% used to be at, was before at 7%. So slight deviations based on the discussion. So interesting. So Georgiana, just the last slide again, what I just mentioned about the hashtags and everything. Of course, this is not the end of the discussion. Next year will be a very busy year on the legislative front. So we look forward to work with all stakeholders, European Commission, DG Connect, Grow, Justice, all of the other ones on these important topics. So thank you again to all the panelists. Thank you, attendees, for joining us. And we look forward to our next event with you somewhere beginning of next year. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to
Thank
everybody.
you very much. It's a pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.